Hi, hey guys. It's Addie from ADHD Explorers. Today we're doing a little bit of a different episode, to our usual, I guess, fun and bubbly, and we are talking about grief. Yesterday marks the 1 year anniversary of my dad passing. So it's a pretty pertinent time, I guess, to be talking about this because anniversaries bring up a lot of feelings. We can go more into that, I guess, in the episode as we talk about it. I just wanted to put a quick trigger warning on at the start of the episode. Obviously, we will be talking about death. And then in some of the responses, people also mentioned suicide, self harm, and murder. So if any of those things may be triggering to you, feel free to skip this episode. And if this is just not the time for you to be listening to something about grief, if you're really early in your own grief journey, maybe this is something you can come back to later. But yeah, let's get into it. So, firstly, I guess, what is grief? So I have just a quick bullet point list here of what is grief from one of the worksheets that I got in my grief counseling group. So I went to group therapy, I guess, for people who are grieving, and they handed out sheets every week. And this is some of the things that they said about it. So it's a multifaceted human response to loss. And to speak more to that, it's for a lot of people, they think about grief as being death, but loss of any kind. So whether that's losing a job, whether that is losing an opportunity in life that you can no longer attain. Loss comes in many ways. A friendship that
A
you don't
girlfriend,
have anymore, a
boyfriend.
breakup, those things are all, yeah, those things are all loss. And so you can grieve those in whatever way you need to. So, yeah, grief is a multifaceted response. Grief work emphasizes that grief is a process that we engage in as active participants, and grief demands attention, refusing to go away automatically with the passage of time. So grief will not just disappear without you actually kind of giving it some attention is essentially what they're saying. It's something that will be there and that you have to work through. It's a process. Grief is not an emotion and a single one feeling. It's a whole process that you go through. Um, and it involves many different things that are all overlapping at the same time. And then your experience of grief will be unique. So no one can tell you what the process will be or how long it will take. Grief takes as long as it takes. There's a common, I guess, saying in a lot of things you look up online that's like, oh, most people grieve after the death of a loved one for a year. And it's, you can't put, just like yesterday, I guess, was a year. And uh, now it's a year and 1 day. And it's like, I still feel, I still miss my dad just as much, right? It's not like you put this timestamp on it and then it's just gone and then you're done. And for some people, it's like a few months and then they maybe feel like that major part of their grieving process is done. And then others, it's like years later, 20 years later, and these things are still coming up. And that's fine. Both ways, it's like, again, it's a process that you go through. Um, and then it just says here grief as a cut, grief as a wave. I think that experience of that loss, that first initial um, point in time when you no longer have that thing or that person in your life, that is the cut. It's like, oh, it hits you right then, like that thing is gone. And then the wave is that it keeps coming back. And when that wave subsides for a bit, you're like, oh, everything is okay. And then the wave comes over you again and you get knocked on your feet. You have to pick yourself up
Hmm.
again. And it's just kind of
So is
learning
it
how to do that and hold your ground.
is that what it's
Yeah, what was that
like?
been?
Um, is that what it's like? Like I know that you're the person that's experienced this, but you're saying that you have these times where everything seems normal, and then this or like I know you said it's not an emotion, but this wave of grief comes back, and like how have you
Yeah.
how do you react to that? What do you do to kind of I don't know, give it attention if that's what you said to do?
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, and a big part of my grief journey and going through counseling that helped was acceptance and being like, oh, I'm feeling this big thing coming up right now, like this feeling of sadness or this feeling of like longing or missing that person. And it's just kind of being like, okay, that's here, and like learning to sit with it and feeling like it's okay and that I don't need to like push this away. Um, there's a really beautiful quote from actually Andrew Garfield that my sister shared yesterday. Um, and it's about how he lost his mum, and someone in an interview was asking him about it, like what was it like, or and he said he started getting emotional, and he was like, yeah, so I might get emotional while I'm talking about this, but that's okay, and that's part of it, and I love that because that
Mm.
these feelings that come up, that's just all of the love that we didn't get to share with that person, and it shows how much we loved them. And so yeah, it's just about like accepting that feeling, whatever that is, whether it's anger, whether it's frustration, whether it's sadness. Those are all parts of the grief experience, and just kind of accepting that and being kind on yourself, which, there is a lot of how we talk about how to manage our ADHD, um, is is part of like getting through those waves and being able to just hold through it and say like, okay, this is what I'm feeling, or like I'm exhausted right now and I need to accept that that part of that tiredness is
Mm.
my grief right now. So yeah, it it comes over you, and it'll come like out of nowhere. You'll just be like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, while
Oh,
I'm just like sitting on a train, like,
yes. And I bet
you
it's
know.
like these emotions that we feel as part of grief, I imagine, aren't ones that we can typically just whack out in public or whack out in the supermarket to be like feeling whatever emotion we're feeling. So I guess like suppress anytime I know that anytime we're suppressing emotion, it does tucker us out. It tires us. So I
Yeah,
guess
yeah.
you're are you saying that you're making time to make sure that you give attention to those emotions? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like
for sure.
you.
And like
Mm.
for me, during the first couple of months, I was in grief therapy, or counseling. And so I had like a dedicated time each week where I would speak to my counselor. And then I went to group counseling, and I was also like going on these grief walks, support walks for people who'd lost a loved
Wow.
one. And so those were really helpful because if I didn't have time in the rest of my week, at least I had these like specific dedicated times where I was like, okay, this is a time I know I'm going to talk about and think about my grief and think about my dad.
Mm.
And I think it's really important to do that. And I'm not saying that everyone has to go to therapy. I do think grief counseling is like really useful. And where I live in Vancouver, I just contacted a local hospice, and they were able to get me six free sessions of grief counseling. And
Oh
so
wow.
that was really useful. And I feel like a lot of places potentially offer that. And there's also groups online. So you can look up like Facebook groups or Discord groups. For your specific type of loss as well. There's probably, like, I looked up parental loss groups, but there's probably also, people who've lost a spouse or children, or, people who've gone through like a big job loss. Like, there are these niches out there on the internet for everything, like how we have our ADHD, Discord group. There is something out there for every uh, community, and that sense of community and other people who've gone through what you've gone through, and that shared experience is so important. Um, yeah, I
I know Riley
I
talks about
meet
it.
other
Sorry.
people now yeah, who've lost their dad, and we have this like welcome to the dead dad club. It sucks here. Um kind of like shared feeling, because it's
It
like,
kind of
oh,
helps to
we
laugh it
know
out
what it's
too.
like. And yeah, it does for sure. And that's definitely been one of my coping mechanisms. Is like,
Mm.
and that's something I really miss about my dad was his like stupid jokes, right? Like that was, I feel like I got my sense of humor from him, and that was something like they were always so dumb, like the jokes he made, but when you don't have them anymore, you really miss that.
Yeah.
So yeah, Ben, what's been your experiences of loss? I know you haven't necessarily like lost a loved one, but yeah, what's some experiences you've had of losing
Well, I definitely want to share
something?
my experience, but I thought like I wanted to ask you because there is a stigma around death. It's not like we are always
Hmm.
acknowledging, oh my gosh, we all die. Like no one's talking like that, but like
Yeah.
it's a reality, right? And it's kind of like hard to accept, because when no one really talks about it, there's a stigma, right? A weird stigma around it. And so I wanted to ask you, like,
Yeah.
when someone when someone close to us has someone who dies, I think a lot of the time people don't know how to react. People don't know how to talk to that person about their loss. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to act
Hmm.
because it's kind of a rare thing, but it happens once per person. But it's relatively like
Yeah.
some people might have had a lot, some like people might have had less. But I wanted to ask you like how like if a friend of ours is going through something, maybe they've just lost someone or even a breakup, or maybe they've lost their parent. What have you learned about your experience about how people have acted towards you that has been helpful? Like, how would you like people to act towards you when someone you love has died or passed on?
Yeah. Um, so I found the most helpful thing was um like the first couple of days, my friends who came over and like literally gave me food. And
Wow.
like, but that you get overwhelmed with that, I think, a little bit during the like first little while. But I think one of the kindest things one of my friends did for me was that I was already having like a bad executive function week, the week my dad died. So I had like a sink full of dishes, and it happened, I think I got the news on the Wednesday morning. So it was like Wednesday. I think I had put it in my to-do list like the day before. I was like, do the dishes. Like I'm gonna get my dishes done on Wednesday. And then, like 1 a.m. in the morning, I get the call. And my friend comes over, and I was like, I was gonna do my dishes today, but I can't do anything. And she like did all my dishes for me. Like
Wow.
just she helped me. And that's like it was disgusting. It was like she was like, okay, I'm not touching this like protein shake holder because that's like my level of I can't do that. But
Yeah.
um I still think that's just like one of the kindest. It's like, okay, I'm gonna like do the thing you physically can't right now.
So it's like
Um
people
and
using their
just,
intuition
you know, yeah.
to help.
The messages are nice, but there's a little bit of like feeling almost then overwhelmed that you have to respond to everyone and be
Reply.
like, oh, thanks for the message, thanks for that.
Yeah. And it adds work
And
in a way.
then yeah, and then there's the whole, oh, like if there's anything I can do, let me know. And actually I found this video on um Instagram of this person talking about it. So I will just share that because it's
Great.
quite relevant.
There's a lot of people around the world grieving right now, including myself, and I just have a suggestion on how to be better for them. Have you ever broad statement that puts it back on the person that's doing the grieving? So instead of saying that, try this. Let me know if I can do any of these following things for you. Let them know specifically what you can do, when you can do it, and how you can do it. When you do this, this decreases the decision fatigue that they're going to be going through. So instead of saying, let me know if there's anything I can do for you,
Yeah, so I think that basically covers it. Um, it's like tell people what you can do according to your capabilities
Done it.
and your capacity. And so because can I do it? Let me know anything I can do for you, and then you think like there's this whole list of like what is possibly anything, and there's probably a lot of things that you actually can't take on because you have your own life and your own commitments. And it's like if you say to someone like, okay, let me know if I can get you groceries, or like let me know if I
Mm.
can take you anywhere, or if you need someone to like go for a walk or something like that. Like be specific because like what they talked about in that video is and that I believe that was Coach Rees on Instagram is decision fatigue. And so where I think this comes into play is like, does that sound familiar? Decision fatigue, as an
Yes.
ADHD. Yeah.
And I
So
feel like
I think that kind of takes us into like,
I feel
yeah,
like any type of strong emotion, it kind of it takes us out of our executive function brain, you know? And I think that as ADHDers, we often have
yes.
emotional dysregulation. And what happens as soon as we feel an emotion? Basically, our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, if you look at the MRIs of this, it just goes dead, it goes black, or it decreases in activity so much. So we just
Mm,
don't have that executive function when we're feeling strong emotions, which I think is
mm-hmm,
a really
mm-hmm.
important thing to think about. They call in meditation, they call it losing the balance of your mind as soon as you feel a strong emotion. And I think that I see what you're saying, that when you're feeling a strong emotion, you don't have that executive function. If you have it even less than a typical neurotypical, maybe, or like we're all humans in this together. We've all
Mm-hmm.
got emotions and executive function parts of our brain. So I see what you're saying. You're saying help that person reduce their decisions they have to make. Be proactive and
Yeah,
intuitive with what help
yeah,
that you can give. That's awesome.
yeah. And I got calls from people I like maybe didn't expect, and one of my friends called me and he was like, "Hey, would you like to do a cooking class like
Oh,
later this month in a week or two? Because I'll book that for you." And like that can be something
wow.
to do like for yourself and like it
That's
actually
beautiful.
sounds really nice. And
That's
you
beautiful.
know, um yeah,
Bringing
just
something that brings
uh
value to your life can take your mind
yeah.
off
And
things.
my roommate at the time was like, "I'm going to the store, like can I get anything from you?" And I was like, "I would like a mango, but sometimes I forget to open my mangoes. So like maybe you can just open my mango for me when I need it." He was like, "Don't worry. Like I'll open your mango when you need it."
Oh, I feel like emotions. Sometimes there are certain emotions that we hide away from in society. You know, like guilt, shame, uncomfort. There are things that we, as soon as we feel them, we have an aversion to. We're almost like, "Whoa, I don't want to feel that," and our initial reaction is
Mm-hmm.
suppress. And I almost feel like what you're saying is that to allow that person to feel is actually one of the most beautiful things you can
Mm-hmm.
do. And if you're grieving, to allow yourself to feel is a beautiful thing to do
Yeah, for
too.
sure.
Wow.
Yeah. And just
Because it must feel
being
like you're
there,
getting
but
knocked off
not
your
feeling
feet, I
like you
feel.
need to say anything. Yeah, it does. It feels like you're just
Mm.
like you have, like, especially those first few days, it's like um, you're just taken aback completely and you don't know how to like navigate the world at all. I felt like I was like walking through like clear sludge. I don't know if that makes sense. Like everything in the world was
Yeah.
like through this like blurry lens.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think just being there and giving people space to cry. You don't have to say anything necessarily. And maybe that's uncomfortable as well. Like being with someone who is, and I think it acknowledging as well if that is too much for you. Um, but also don't not talk about it, I think.
Yes.
And you hear that a lot is like people say that like their friends just like stopped mentioning that person's name,
Mm.
or
Yeah.
like one of the guys in my grief walk group, like his wife had died, and people just like kind of like stopped talking about his wife, and it's like this person is like in
Mm.
your life constantly all the time, like you want to talk about them, that's like all you want to do is
Yes.
talk about them, and like give people that, like ask people what their favorite memory with that person, or
That's a
like
nice thing.
what their person's favorite food was, and like you know listen to them talk about their person, if that's the situation, if they want to as well. Like everyone's grief is different, some people just don't want to talk about it at all. But yeah, just meet the person where they're at, I guess. So I kind of wanted to talk about the parallels of grief and ADHD. And so I have the Psych Central How Grief Affects Your Brain. So it's like, what are the effects of grief on the brain? So grief is a stress response, essentially, like chronic stress. Um, so, you're going through this really stressful period, and chronic stress puts the brain into long-term survival mode. So your fight or flight hormones are released, your heart rate increases, blood flow to more emotional and fear-based parts of your brain. So it can trigger, like, for me, trust issues came out because you're putting yourself in this state of like survival, because you're like, well, this person in my life is gone and now everyone's going to leave me and I'm going to be alone. Um, and so it mentions that over time, grief can affect attention, memory, decision making, the ability to choose words and express yourself with the right language, information processing speed, cognitive functions that rely on movement, and depth perception.
Wow.
Does
Depth
this sound
perception.
familiar?
Wow. Well, it
Yeah.
sounds like there's a lot of parallels with grief and ADHD because, like, we are always trying both, like, people with grief and people with ADHD, and also when they combine, we're all trying to deal with intense emotions and, like, kind of stress upon the brain, like trying to compute
Mm-hmm.
a new reality, or in terms of grief, when something so big has changed. And with ADHD, trying to cope with chaos all the time, in every form. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, um, in terms of grounding, because you were talking that you feel like sometimes you were walking through a thick fog. So it must feel like, when
Yeah.
emotions are so intense, and we have this with ADHD too, our brain kind of disassociates. It leaves the present moment. It goes into daydream land or avoidance or whatever. And so I imagine that things like things that ground you to your body again, that place the attention on the body again, must be really helpful.
Yes. So, there is a couple of techniques actually that my grief counselor shared with me. So I right now I'm like playing with or like touching my pounamu, which is a green stone from New Zealand that my cousin gave me when I went back for my dad's celebration of life. So that holds significance because it's from my homeland, and then also it's just like something I can have that I can touch, and it's like physically there, and it kind of is like
Mm,
a grounding stone for me. Um, so something like that can help, like having a stone or something physical to touch. One thing that my therapist taught me was thumb pulling. So it can be like pulling back on your thumb and then counting to five and like listing five things that you can see around you in the room. And just kind of like physically, because that sensation, like, oh, it pulls you back. And then
mm.
the process of like looking around you like takes you back into the real like physical space and out of that.
It's
like
like
heavy fog
anti-daydream
that
mode, anti-aversion mode.
yes, yes. And
That's really cool.
there was another one. Yeah, just, the normal like uh breathing, box breathing can help as well. To reset your nervous system. Um my both my current therapist and my grief counselor would have me do a couple of breaths, big deep breaths at the start of each session because that then just like
Wow.
helps regulate your nervous system. So
Brings you
yeah,
right
those
back.
are things, yeah, that can help. Um, yeah, so I found that for me, the thing that I think my grief affected the most, which relates to my ADHD, was like my capacity. So, um, the last year, I feel like my capacity to take things on has just like shrunk massively. And that's
Mm.
probably related to like executive function because we already struggle with executive function, right? And like doing things, task
Mm-hmm.
initiation, and not getting overwhelmed. And I just felt like the last year, my ability to do things without getting overwhelmed was way less. So I was training for a national sports team, which probably took up like maybe 10 hours of my week of training time. So, like, yeah, 3 hours in the gym, 2, 3 hours of swimming, and then hockey, another 2, 3 hours. So, yeah, maybe 10 to 12 hours. And then I was working, I do a little bit of contracting, maybe 10 hours on average. So that's like just over 20 hours of my week. Um, and then that's like a part-time job, right? So and that was my capacity. And most people, like the girls on my team, work a 40-hour job. Some of them have kids, plus they were training. And like most people, yeah, work 40 hours, have like all of this other stuff going on in their lives. And I feel like I potentially could have done that before. And now I'm like, nope, I just
Yeah.
like
So it's like with your
basic
reduced
living.
capacity, I guess that maybe you've like focused more on, or like with the capacity you have, you've probably been focusing on self-care as a primary objective.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that's how it's kind of affected me a lot. And then also, yeah, on the emotional side, I would say there were periods where my trigger was way less. So I have like tried to do a lot of work over the last few years on helping to get my emotional regulation like a little bit better. Um, and
Mm.
then yeah, there was definitely periods like over Christmas, especially because that's already like a stressful period. And I was with my partner's family, and I just felt like I had like no, I was just like and my partner said he was like, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells all the time, and I was like, yeah, well, I feel like I'm walking
Yeah.
on ice, and that if I take one step, I'm going to crash into freezing cold water and I'm going to drown. Like that is how I
Yeah.
feel, and that
Yeah.
feeling was so
Mm.
intense, you know,
Yeah.
and that was part of my experience that was like really difficult. I was like, I feel like I'm stuck and I can't take a step in any direction because I will drown. And that
Yeah.
is so overwhelming that then yeah, you can't
Yeah.
like take on other things in life because it overpowers you. Um and so accepting that was hard, but like I had to be like, look, this is where I'm at and I like cannot do anymore right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's okay, you
That's
know.
yeah.
And you're gonna feel angry and you're gonna feel upset and you're going to snap at people in your life. And I'm very grateful for my partner that he has been there and stuck through this with me. Because I am sure there are relationships that break down during a grieving period because of the way that people react to each other. Um, So,
Yeah. We're
you
so
know,
we're so uninformed when it comes to our nervous system states and polyvagal theory. You know, it's obvious that you
yeah.
were in a very, very high stimulation point of your brain. Your nervous system is overwhelmed, and you we don't even typically talk about how to regulate down to a calm state, and especially like it's definitely harder
Mm-hmm.
to. But I just want to share that I really appreciate that you can share your true experience and help others go through too. And I know it's like hard
Mm,
to like feel these
thanks.
feelings, especially while being like recorded and stuff. So like
Yeah.
thanks for
And they
sharing
come
and
up. I
thanks for
didn't put
like
mascara on today because I was like,
yeah. And
I'm
you
probably
should
gonna
feel
cry.
free. I'm so glad that you feel free to
Yeah.
cry because that's what you're saying is the answer. You should feel free to feel any emotion and I'm gonna help hold space for that too.
Yeah.
So yeah, you.
So,
I'm so
I asked, thanks. Yeah, I asked on our Instagram for people to share their experiences with grief. And so I thought we could kind of just go through a couple of people's responses. So I'll bring up um
yeah.
those and
While you
maybe we
bring it
can
up,
just kind of like alternate.
I wanted to share a quote
Yeah.
that
What's
I had a very hard breakup. You know, it was someone that I was very, very close to for a long time. And, you know, we shared all the secrets we
hmm
could. We were very bonded. And then it was a very fast, instantaneous breakup that I didn't really see coming. And I carried this kind of
mm,
emotion with me and I pushed it down for a long time. And I didn't ever understand what that emotion was or how it was affecting my idea of who I am. I think my reaction was that I was worthless, you know, and that was my the way I told my brain that I had been like I've been feeling so worthless for so long, and I didn't because I didn't understand what the emotion was. Like I was so uninformed in terms of like what emotions were and what felt like. So there was this quote that really helped me understand what was going on. That goes, grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot.
mm,
And I think that helped me
yeah.
understand that what I was feeling, this like core pain in like my chest, was a fountain of love that like didn't know where to go. And I was like, oh, well, I'll put that on myself then.
Yeah.
Like, if I have all this love that's around and I don't know where to put it, I'll just put it on myself to nourish myself again. Because that's what I had been missing. You know, I was
Yeah.
hating myself in response to that breakup. But actually, when I poured that love on
Uh,
myself, I was like, oh, this is where it can go. Thank you, body, for telling me what you need. Thanks. Appreciate you. So yeah, I think that quote is just really important
yeah.
to
And
understand. You know, it helps us give context to our feelings. How is that for you?
yeah, no, that's really beautiful. It's very relevant. I think like similarly to a breakup, when someone dies, like, yeah, maybe that person's still alive in the breakup, but if you're not talking to them, it's a similar experience in that
Hmm.
like that relationship is now one-sided, right? And so
Yeah.
it's the same with death.
Mm.
It, there's like a, I guess, weird niceness in a way to like that side of if someone's died, like you can kind of continue that relationship in a way where you still give them your love. It's just like you're not getting any back
Yeah.
necessarily. Whereas yeah, with a breakup, it might feel weird. I mean, theoretically, you can still do that. You can still like maybe you don't actually like send the messages and like physically, but like you can still emotionally like send love to that person if you need to. But like I like that idea of then turning it around and being like, okay, I'm gonna give this love to me. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really
Yeah.
nice.
They helped me manage it. So what has the
So
community
one of,
shared with us?
yeah, so I mean the first one here is pretty relevant. Dad passing highlighted my ADHD. Dopamine from fearing him went away. My brain stopped. Um, So I'm not sure if this is like someone who maybe didn't have the best relationship with their dad. It sounds like from fearing him, that constant like level of living in slight fear of someone maybe kept, yeah, like your brain working. But yeah, then they said my brain stopped, and I was like, yeah, that is relevant.
Mm.
Someone's gone, and then your brain's just like, I don't brain anymore.
I think it's because we don't talk about it in typical society. Like, one, the emotions, and two, what grief really is. You're saying it's a set of emotions, a set of physiological responses. And so, like, I think like having this
Mm-hmm.
conversation is actually really important.
Yeah.
What's this person say?
Someone else said, my mum died nearly 2 years ago. Only after did I realize I've got ADHD. Grief opened me up.
Ah, because I guess it must force you to feel. You can't help but feel. When the feelings are flowing.
Mm,
And that's interesting. Grief opened me up. Because I think a lot of the time we're living in, what do they call it? Freeze, like permanent freeze. Functional freeze is what they call it, where we've like
mm,
suppressed all of our emotions. And when we're saying no to all the emotions, they like yell loudly and explode, right? I think that's typical or very much the case in a lot of ADHDers. So it's interesting that like grief opened that person up because they were like forced to feel.
yeah, maybe it's them because those emotions just get so loud that you can't
Mm,
quiet them anymore. And then you just have to acknowledge
mm.
it. Or it opened them up as in like, like feeling like you're physically being wrenched open. It's painful.
Ah,
It's
yes.
open to interpretation, I guess. Um, Someone else said, to me, time doesn't heal. It gets harder and harder after a year and a half. Yeah, that's something interesting. I think people say, oh, it'll get easier with time. And they mean
Mm,
well in saying that. Um, but I was like reflecting on this yesterday that like it's been a year, but it almost feels like it's just been a few months because I'm used to not talking to my dad for a couple months at a time because we lived overseas, right? And that was just our relationship. Um, and then I almost feel like this sense of guilt for feeling like it's only been a few months, but actually it's been a year. It's like, shit, Adam, you haven't talked to your dad in a year because he's dead. Like, you should feel bad about that, like, that you feel like it's been less time. But then that's I think a weird way that like grief and ADHD interact is that it like warps your time perception. Because
mm.
we already have like weird time perception, I guess. And then grief also kind of like warps your sense of time on top of that, I think. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say time necessarily like heals as a blanket statement. I think there's some parts of time that help it be easier to accept. But then, yeah, then there's also like, oh, it's been like even longer. You know, when you haven't seen a friend in a long time, and you're like, oh, I really miss them. And then you're like, oh, it's been 3 years and like I haven't spoken to them in like 6 months. And wow, yeah, that's been so long. And then when you realize that how long it's been, it kind of is like a bit more of a stab, do you know?
Yeah.
And
It's
so I think
interesting when
there's
people say
that
like,
element.
"Oh, you'll feel better, like time will heal." I think people say that in our society to kind of be a nice thing, but it's almost like it's not time in
Mm,
itself, it's attention given to the emotions or attention given to processing it. Maybe that is what helps actually
hmm.
heal, is what you said earlier. So it's funny that we
Yeah.
have this misconception that we say, "Oh, time heals," but not exactly. Actually, it's giving attention and crystallizing the new reality that you live in acceptance is
Yeah.
how you put it. And then this person said,
Um,
this is talking about their mum.
yeah.
Just didn't want to interact with anyone, neither in person or online. I feel that there, like in periods of my life where I've had deep depression, I close off to everyone because I don't have the resource or the capacity. And I think that's totally a thing to do. Like, and I think we need that time too to process everything that's happened in our life. Is sometimes in reference to this person we've lost, or you know, they give context to
Mm,
life, they give meaning to life. And I think to to
mm-hmm.
process that takes time to be away from the noise of day-to-day life.
Yeah, for sure.
What's this next? Do you want to
This
read some?
person said, I lost my dad. Yeah, I lost my dad. My ADHD went through the roof. I have too much to do and I can't cope. That's almost like what I was saying earlier. We was like my
Mm.
capacity just shrunk, right? Like I
Hmm.
I just can't do all the things that you feel like you should do. Um, Someone else said I had way worse memory than usual. I felt like ADHD and PTSD were overlapping and it lasted about 1 year.
Mm.
Yeah, so memory issues is really
Yes.
common with grief, and like we already have memory issues with ADHD, but it's like, yeah, like complete goodbye to short-term memory. At least for the first few
We
months
have to
for
do a
me, it was
whole,
like I can't
yeah.
remember anything.
We have to do a whole episode on the overlap between PTSD or CPTSD and ADHD, because it, like, in terms of emotional
Yes.
regulation, memory, everything, there's like a gigantic overlap where, like, to be honest, a lot of people don't know if it's the same condition or similar. You know, it's definitely like similar things at play. So we should definitely explore that.
Hmm.
Because I feel like, you know, when strong emotions come, we're not present. We're in a type of daydream, or kind of like unpresent state of mind. So it does take
Hmm.
processing. I like how you, or like we were talking earlier about how when these intense emotional experiences happen, we almost do need time alone to just process, and to focus on just self-care and feeling, allowing ourselves to feel.
Hmm. Hmm. Someone else mentioned that my soulmate was murdered. Time issues make it feel like it just happened. The cuts stay open. Yeah, I feel that. And I think this might be a little bit of a universal grief experience. The feeling of like um that remembering again that it happened and then like reopening that wound. But it probably is more present in people with ADHD. It's like you again, like you forget that you haven't spoken to that person in a little while, and then you think about them, and then you go, "Oh no, shit, they're dead." Yeah, like that, and then you
When they
then you
say
have to
time issues,
refeel it.
yes, when they say that time issues make it feel like it just happened, it reminded me of when my therapist said that when we feel something that is so emotional that our brain can't compute it, it's almost like it's a Word document in our brain, right? And that it freezes to read only instead of editable. And we become stuck in that mindset
Oh,
of where
yeah.
we were at that time. And so that we become triggered easily when it's relevant to those things, because our emotions like haven't been rewritten. It's almost like those the triggers stay really fresh, because when those things happen, it's almost like we are there mentally because we haven't processed it. And we don't even talk normally about how to process emotions. You know, no one's like, "Oh, lie down and do yoga nidra and feel your body." You know, no one's talking about it enough. So
Mm-hmm.
um, I think the factor, I think that really helped me understand why I was emotionally triggered by things. You know, in terms of when I've been triggered by things, because it's just that I hadn't processed some things that I was suppressing. You know, I didn't want to feel, because sometimes you just don't want to feel uncomfortable things. Like you want a break, and and I think it's important to take breaks from feeling too, because it's so intense, especially for ADHDers. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Someone else said I tried to commit suicide after my best friend and grandma died. I couldn't handle the grief. Um,
Mm.
I think that's really pertinent because suicide and self-harm are higher risk factors in people with ADHD. I think we're like statistically more likely to die by suicide than the neurotypical population. And then add on top of that, like grief. I last year, for the first time in like several years, had the thought of self-harming. I did not, but like the feelings that I was having, the that experience of those emotions was so strong at certain points that that's where my brain went, because that's a former coping mechanism, right? That I've had in the past when I was a teenager. And so your brain goes back there. It's like, though, this is what I did before to get rid of strong emotions, because then when you feel something physically, you don't have to feel it mentally and emotionally anymore, right? Um, and there's um, alternatives to that, you know. Um, you can
Yeah,
shock yourself
it's almost like you're
physically.
trying
Like
to.
my friend said, she puts her head in the freezer, and it's kind of like you physically are like shocking yourself, or you run an ice cube down your arm as like to kind
Mm.
of mimic that sensation, but without actually hurting yourself. Um, but yeah,
I
I
guess it's
think
like it's like a four. It's like a they're trying to find a way to ground or reconnect with their body again because it can become so numb.
mhm,
And another thing that
yes,
people have found helpful is rubber bands on wrist, and like pulling it out and letting go, because
yes,
it
yeah,
allows you to feel physical
and
sensation, and I think that's what you're really looking for.
is a way of physicalizing like this strong emotional experience. Yeah. And go punch a pillow, or something
Mm.
that is not hurting yourself or others. But yes, it's very relatable, and I can understand why someone would be put to that point of thoughts of suicide while going through grief, because yeah, it just brings everything
Mm.
to the surface. Someone else just said it made my symptoms worse. Um, I'd love to hear about ADHD breakups and grief, which is kind of what you've mentioned, where yeah, like that person is no longer in your life,
Yeah.
so they've just been taken away. Um, oh, this one is
Trauma, I think, is an
interesting. I
important thing
lost a
to
friend to
mention.
suicide. Yeah. I lost a friend to suicide, and I find myself hyper focusing over it. Yeah, I feel like that is an area that, like, it's a normal part of grief, I think, to have kind of somewhat obsessive thinking about that person, or constant, like, no, you're not able to take your mind off that person. Um, but yeah, though the ADHD hyperfocus, then I can imagine would potentially like put us more into just like looking down like rabbit holes of like that person's life, and hyper focusing over the situation and how these things happened. And yeah.
I think there are a lot of
Did you want to read
parallels.
the next one?
Yeah, it says it made my ADHD 100% worse. Trauma means memory loss, inability to concentrate, etc. And what it made me think is that grief and trauma is like almost a similar thing, because like Gabor Mate, who's an amazing psychologist and or doctor, I can't remember, but he said that trauma is when an emotion is so strong or so intense that we don't know how to process it with our brain, and so it gets like stored in the nervous system. And I feel like there's a lot of parallels to grief there, because like I think that when there is an emotion that's like in our nervous system, it has a certain energy to it, and it doesn't know how to be released, and it all is linked to those nervous system states. We have that agitation, we have like fear, all those other levels of polyvagal theory. And
Mm.
what deers do, for example, that we don't do in human society, or when a deer is chased by a lion, and it's like been in its jaws and it's been in freeze. Freeze is one of them nervous system states, and it's been like freaked out, an emotion that's too strong to process. What it does, if it gets away, it goes in a bush or something, and it just shakes, and it just shakes and shakes and shakes until the energy is released. And we obviously don't talk about that in typical society, that you should shake to freaking process random emotions that are stuck in your body. But that's why things like ecstatic dances, where you can just do any movement you want to process trauma and emotions that are stuck in the body. I think that's why they're so helpful, because it's like a place in human societies where we can all shake together. But I think it's important to share that, like animals know what they're doing with trauma, and humans, for some reason, we've forgotten how to process these intense emotions, and forgotten how to hold space to allow people to feel their emotions. I think that's why it's so important to, have this conversation and to share.
Yeah.
Great.
Someone else said, I felt surreal at first. Then once the realization hit, it was overwhelming, crippling. And then another person mentioned that too many things running in my mind. I couldn't cry. Understood that they were gone 1 to 2 months late. And
Wow, I can't
that's
cry.
okay too. Everyone
That's
deals with
sad.
things in a different way. And yeah, overwhelm makes sense that you like are just stuck and can't potentially process those emotions. Um, we have a couple of like longer replies here, but I think we're running a bit long on this episode. Um, so it might be a good place to end. But I just want to thank everyone who shared all of their experiences with us. We really appreciate the community and everyone reaching out. Um, if you are
We have.
grieving
Go
right
ahead.
now, I just want to give you like a big hug. And I'm not going to say it's going to be okay, because it might not be okay for a while. And that is okay. You know?
So, if you found this useful, or someone that's in this situation, maybe they've just lost someone, send them this episode, and hopefully it will help them. I hope that we've helped you understand something that's useful to your life. For other ADHD helpful things, we have ADHDoers.com, where it's pay as you feel for our ebooks that are just stuffed full of information that's helpful. And rate this podcast great. Rate it great as you can.
Rate
We
it
appreciate
great.
you. We love you. And you can follow us on Instagram now. We just got an Instagram, which is ADHD Explorers. And you probably know about
Yeah.
ADHDers too. It's our main thing. So thanks for joining us. We love you so much. And keep allowing
Yeah.
yourself to
And I'm
feel.
giving you all a big hug.
Cool. Lots of love from Benno and Addy.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.